In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gather to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome back to Tholos Talks as we continue our series understanding the thriving trade in looted antiquities. Before we jump in, a quick reminder that the Basilinna Institute shares insights beyond this podcast at basilinna.com/insights. Basilinna Advisory provides strategic guidance across business, government relations, and communications. Our team of well-connected experts brings a deep understanding of global dynamics and the strategic expertise needed to keep you competitive in today's ever-changing world order. Our work spans biodiversity and nature financing, culture and heritage, financial services, health, and of course, technology, trade, and more. If you're looking for strategic support in any of these areas or for insights that go beyond the headlines, please reach out to info@basilinna.com. Now let's jump in. Today, we welcome Jason Felch, investigative journalist and co-author of Chasing Aphrodite, the groundbreaking exposé that revealed how major institutions, including the Getty Museum, knowingly acquired looted artifacts. Jason has deep experience tracking the illicit flow of antiquities. He also founded and curates the Museum of Looted Antiquities, a digital platform documenting and analyzing repatriated artifacts. His current research uncovers how museums, collectors, and digital marketplaces shape today's illicit trade and informs an upcoming report with the Antiquities Coalition of building more transparent systems of accountability. Our conversation pulls back the curtain on how cultural heritage moves from conflict zones into respected museums and private collections, examining how illicit artifacts enter the legitimate market, the roles institutions and collectors play, knowingly or not, in perpetuating this trade and what accountability looks like in a system built on centuries of cultural exploitation. We're honored to have you with us today, Jason.
Thanks, Deborah.
So before we jump into the specifics, I'd love just to hear how you got into this field. You had a really successful career in investigative journalism before turning your focus to antiquities. And what sparked your interest in this subject? And how did your book, Chasing Aphrodite, come about?
Yeah, thank you. I kind of stumbled into this world of the illicit antiquities trade as a young investigative reporter at the Los Angeles Times. I was part of a team that began investigating the Getty Museum in 2004, 2005. And initially, we were looking at issues related to how the nonprofit foundation was using its resources and how the CEO, Barry Munitz, was misusing the Getty's resources. It was only after a year of doing that reporting that one of my sources pulled me aside and said, that's not the big story at the Getty. The big story at the Getty is how it built its Antiquities collection. And that is not something I had spent much time thinking about. How do museums acquire ancient art? What does the marketplace for ancient art look like? And so we began digging in and looking at how the Getty had built its Antiquities collection over really 50 years, going back to J. Paul Getty himself. And it was that process of discovery led me into this a very woolly world of antiquities traffickers, looters all across the Mediterranean, and the relationship that American museums had with this black market, and the business deals that they were doing with these traffickers to fill our local museums with ancient art.
You've had a real impact on the field, and you were one of the earliest to start looking at the illicit trade. What were some of the revelations that came out in your book, Chasing Aphrodite? And what have you seen as some of the changes between that time and today?
The reason we wrote Chasing Aphrodite after a long series of investigative reports in the LA Times was because we felt like there was still a piece of the story that we hadn't told. And that was really documenting and understanding what the museum knew about the antiquities it was buying and how their own policies around acquisition of ancient art evolved over time. And so we dug deep further into the Getty's historical archives to really understand the evolution of its collecting practices there. And in the process, what we concluded was that not just the Getty, but most American museums during the 70s, 80s, and 90s were knowingly acquiring looted antiquities and building relationships with traffickers to get access to the best stuff that was coming out of the ground from archaeological sites around the Mediterranean. So to me, that was the big revelation, was that it was not an accidental slip up that museums were in business with these people. It was a purposeful strategy aimed at building the very best collections that they could by doing business with the black market.
And that really is fascinating. And that really, I think you started to shed light on this intricate, almost global web that was created around what at that time many people didn't even think was really a crime.
Yeah, at the time, and this is kind of 2006 to 2011, there was a lot of focus on Italy and the Mediterranean. The Italian authorities had launched an investigation into one of the major antiquities traffickers, Giacomo Medici, and used his archive of photographs of the looted objects that he had trafficked to trace those objects around the world. What we discovered as we dug deeper was that Medici was not an outlier. He was part of a global black market that operates around the world. And so as I've continued to investigate the illicit antiquities trade in the years since, what we found is that there are similar, pretty sophisticated criminal networks operating really anywhere there are rich archaeological materials. So across the Middle East, across Southeast Asia and South Asia, and in Latin America and Africa, all of these countries have networks that are similar to this, where recently excavated archaeological material is being kind of repackaged with false provenance for the market.
So now it's about 20 some years after you started this initial research. What sort of changes have you seen, whether it's in attitudes or in sophistication of the trade?
There's been a lot of dramatic changes, starting really in 2008, in the wake of our series in the LA Times. I think because of the evidence that we gathered showing museums were knowingly doing business with these black markets, the museum community initiated, through the Association of Art Museum Directors, a series of reforms of kind of collecting policies for American institutions that required them to take the issues of provenance or ownership history of these archaeological objects more seriously. And so what you see starting with 2008 and really ramping up over the next several years is a series of largely voluntary acquisition policies being adopted by museums that increase the scrutiny of these antiquities before they're acquired. That continued to evolve as new evidence continued to emerge that American museums were still buying looted antiquities, whether knowingly or unknowingly. And unfortunately, that issue continues today. We see recent examples of museums acquiring looted antiquities, failing to do the proper due diligence. So while there have been significant reforms in the museum community, there have also been lots of signs of continuing problems. And part of that is that their initial focus was on the Mediterranean networks that we were looking at. And they were slower to conduct similar scrutiny of networks out of Asia, out of India, South America. And so they've been catching up slowly. But I would say overall, there's been significant improvements in the museum sector. There are other sectors where really the problems have not evolved much. And I would single out the auction houses. I was just looking yesterday at upcoming auction houses, upcoming auction sales in December. And it continues to be the case that there are notorious antiquities traffickers who are listed on the major auction houses as the provenance of record for objects. And those are not secret names. Those are names that anybody who follows this issue knows about. But objects with those names as their provenance are continuing to be sold on the antiquities market every day.
That's really interesting because it is a whole sort of supply chain. And it's good to hear that the museums are paying closer attention. And certainly we've seen increased scrutiny of the collections of museums coming from people like the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, who have had a particular focus on the Met Museum, but haven't seen the same kind of focus on the auction houses. Do you think that's next?
I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm not sure why, but the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which has really done pioneering work on this issue, has so far not focused on the auction houses the same way it has museum collections. There have certainly been a number of seizures from auction houses and objects recovered from auction houses that were clearly looted. That continues on a regular basis. But what we've seen in the past is that what really moves the needle and changes market behavior is the risk of criminal exposure. And there is certainly some evidence to suggest that auction houses are in business with some of the same actors that museums were in business with. There have been some efforts to criminally indict and convict both dealers and collectors, and in some cases, even museum curators over their activity with the black market. We have not seen that same focus on the auction houses, and I'm curious as to why not.
I think that's really a good question. And we haven't seen the same level of criminal penalties here in the United States that we've seen in places like Europe as well.
That's right. European law enforcement has gotten very sophisticated. Yesterday, we just had news of a major Europol operation focused in Bulgaria, where 100 million euros worth of looted antiquities were seized. Law enforcement has been catching up on this issue and prioritizing it in a way that was not the case 20 years ago when I started looking at this. Some of that attention has focused on the dealers and dealer networks that operate in Europe, but we haven't seen the same focus on auction houses in Europe. Nor museums in Europe, which are more established collections because of their colonial histories, but still continue to acquire recently excavated material to this day.
Very interesting. So what do you think should be done in the case of the auction houses?
Well, the auction houses have a very conservative view of the law, meaning they read the various patrimony laws and the U.S. laws quite conservatively to allow them to buy and sell antiquities as long as they've been documented since 2003, which is a very late date. 2003 is when the Cultural Property Implementation Act was adopted in the United States. But most museums, archaeologists, and others in the field use 1970 as a cutoff date for when good provenance is required. So I would like to see auctions, first of all, cut their ties to known antiquities traffickers. They continue to sell objects that came through known antiquities traffickers. They don't need to do that. Obviously, they run a business and they're looking to make money off of these objects. But I think they should draw a line with these cases where there's obvious connections to known traffickers. And I would like to see them over time adopt 1970 as a cutoff date, because I think what we've learned is as long as there are people buying these things, the looting will continue. This is a supply and demand issue. And as long as there is demand on the Western art markets to buy these things, which the auction houses are a major facilitator of, there will continue to be supply of looted antiquities in the source countries.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the fact that it's a largely unregulated market too allows for a lot of illegal activity to happen.
Right. I mean, the Antiquities Coalition has done pioneering work to address this at a policy level and a legislative level. And that work is really important because our work shows that voluntary regulation, self-regulation, is not the most effective way to do this. It basically puts institutions in the position of policing themselves against their own business interests. And that's just, we don't use that regulatory policy in any other field except the art market. And self-regulation has pretty obvious flaws. So some of the work that you all have done to encourage the United States to adopt the Bank Secrecy Act as a standard of due diligence for art transactions is really important, because even outside of the antiquities field, the art market is replete with shady dealers and questionable financial transactions. The auction houses sit right in the middle of that and are taking on a lot of risk by continuing to operate in the ways they have.
Absolutely. I mean, we were really surprised that there are greater regulatory requirements on a pawn shop than there are in art market transactions.
Exactly.
So you can't pawn your painting, but you can sell it through an auction.
You can sell it at auction, exactly.
Declaring the buyer or seller. Exactly. So switching gears a little bit in your continuum in this field, you've launched the Museum of Looted Antiquities. And what was your thinking behind that?
Yeah, this is a project near and dear to my heart because it tries to address a problem that you and I have discussed before, and that I encountered all the time as a journalist and an author writing about this issue. The problem is we don't know how big the problem is.
Exactly.
We know that looted antiquities are being bought and sold every day. We see news stories about repatriations every day in the news. These are major controversies, and they're affecting some of the most important cultural institutions in our lives, but we can't say how big of a problem it is. And the reason for that is twofold. One is it is a black market. And so it's inherently difficult to measure. And it's not an easy task to study black markets and to come up with metrics that are credible. The second issue, though, is that nobody's really tried. And this gets to some of the challenges of studying this issue, which is the illicit antiquities trade kind of falls through the cracks of traditional academic fields of criminology. It is obviously lesser than the illicit drug trade, which gets a lot of the attention, and human trafficking, which has very serious consequences. And so it has somewhat been neglected by experts around the world in an effort to study it and really quantify what's going on. And so the Museum of Looted Antiquities kind of operates on two levels. On the front end, on the publicly available level, it is a place where we collect, study, and display repatriated objects. So these are looted antiquities that have been returned to their countries of origin. And we highlight these cases that have particular significance to show how the objects moved through the market, where they ended up, often in local institutions, and why and how they were returned to their countries of origin. Usually that came about because evidence of their illicit path through the market came to light. And so we think that repatriations, which are happening around the world these days on a daily basis, are a really key way to start measuring the scope of the illicit antiquities trade. And so what we're doing is we're collecting, using open source investigative techniques, all available information about antiquities repatriation since 1950. Some of those become case studies on our website, but the part of it that I'm really excited about and that we're working together on a report on is the potential for really novel data that can emerge from a close study of these objects. So for every repatriation case we find, we collect 56 different data fields in which we're attempting to take an anecdote about an individual object and turn it into rigorous data that we can use to really begin to map the bigger problem. And so we've done that now for more than 1 million looted antiquities across about 1,500 cases of repatriation. And from each of these, we're extracting data and generating data with a team of volunteers to create the metrics that we need to study this issue with more rigor.
Well, we're very excited about cooperating with you on the report because we think that it has already uncovered some very interesting trends and will be the basis of some really important policy recommendations. And so we look forward to sharing it with any of our listeners in the very near future. But through this work, you clearly have been involved in some interesting cases. And I'd love to hear a little more detail. We've talked a lot on this series about the Douglas Latchford case. We haven't talked too much about some of the accomplices that he had, particularly in New York. And I know you've written about some of them and some of the other important cases, and would love to hear just a few details, because I think as you dig into these, it's fascinating to uncover the networks and how they were operating.
Yeah, what we found in general is that these dealers are at the top of trafficking networks that have a broad reach into archaeologically rich countries. And that these dealers, while you'd think they would be competitors with each other, are often co-conspirators and collaborating. And so we saw that with the Douglas Latchford case. Latchford, of course, was a British dealer and collector based in Bangkok who really dominated the trade in looted Khmer objects coming out of Cambodia during the period of the Khmer Rouge all the way forward to the 90s and 2000s. One of the fascinating things, and that's a case that we've studied deeply and worked on over the years, one of the things that you flagged that we've seen is that Latchford had dealings with other people in the market. And so one of the more prominent dealers that he had dealings with was a mother-daughter team of Manhattan antiquities dealers named Doris and Nancy Weiner. The Weiner Gallery is a really significant dealership in Manhattan, or was for many decades. Doris Weiner, the mother, really helped establish Asian arts as a collecting priority in the United States. Mm-hmm. Going back to the 60s, she was championing the acquisition of these objects, and her gallery was bringing these incredible relics from across Asia to American collectors and museums. And so she was really at the top of the market in Asian arts. Her daughter, Nancy, took over that business when Doris died. And Nancy continued the tradition of supplying really top-end Asian art to the Western art market. What became clear as we began investigating Latchford and Nancy Weiner was that her supply chain for these objects was very similar to what we'd seen in the Mediterranean countries that we'd looked at. She was connected to a network of looters and smugglers and antiquities traffickers who were sourcing material directly from archaeological sites, often from temples that were still under active worship in Asia, and some of them UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Her suppliers, which she inherited from her mother in a sense, were plundering these sites to supply the Western art market. We began investigating Nancy Weiner's activities and documenting the various museums that had acquired objects from her and from her mother, and built up a rather detailed picture of the supply networks that she was using that were looting this material. That culminated in her arrest in Manhattan and her ultimate conviction by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And Nancy's criminal conviction became a real warning shot across the broader market that these issues were not relegated to Italy, Greece, and Turkey, which had been getting a lot of the attention, and they were much broader and applied beyond that. A second case that I'd flag for you, which was equally important and also had a chilling effect on the illicit trade, was the case of Subhash Kapoor. Kapoor was an Indian American. He'd brought his family to the States in the 1980s and opened a gallery on Madison Avenue called Art of the Past, which again had built over time relationships with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with a lot of leading galleries, not just in the United States, but in Australia, in Asia. He was supplying some of the most remarkable Asian artifacts to the market for decades. He famously, for people that met him, was missing his right ear. And we learned through our investigation that he had lost that ear as a child when he was kidnapped. His father was an antiques dealer in India and involved with organized crime, who had kidnapped young Subhash as a child and cut off his ear as a threat to his father before he was ransomed back. So like Nancy and Doris, Subhash had been in this business, was a second generation participant in the antiquities trade, had brought his family and his work to the United States, and became the subject of a sweeping criminal indictment and a series of raids by law enforcement. Homeland Security investigations raided a dozen of his properties and seized more than $120 million worth of looted ancient art in those storage facilities in Manhattan after he was arrested. This gives you a small window into the scope of the scale of this business, which is really what we're trying to measure now with the Museum of Looted Antiquities. Kapoor's collection alone, this is just his inventory at the time of his arrest, had thousands of objects worth $120 million. That was just his inventory in a moment in time. And so that's a snapshot of the kind of scale of material that he had been trafficking really over 4 decades. These cases are really important, and the work that law enforcement is doing on these cases is really important because they give us this rare window into how the black market works and who the key players are.
Absolutely. So what would you say to the collecting public? What are the kinds of red flags that they should be looking for?
Yeah, I think there's some obvious things and there are some less obvious things that collectors and buyers and anyone looking to acquire ancient art should be aware of. Because of our work and the work that you all have done and a number of other people, there is pretty well documented evidence about who some of these networks are. And so the most basic due diligence before you acquire an artifact should include some rigorous questioning of the seller about where the object has been since 1970, at least. 1970 is not a magic rule. There are objects that precede 1970 that are stolen property and that also need to be scrutinized. But 1970 is a good place to say, can I say where this thing was before 1970? And is there any evidence that it left its country of origin after that, not before that? So that's kind of the first most basic question is, where has this object been? Now, dealers will tell buyers, well, for many of these things, the collecting standards have changed, so we just don't know. But trust me, this one's fine. And we should be very skeptical of what dealers tell us about these objects. Any association with known traffickers is definitely a red flag. And one of the things that we're doing in the future with the data that we're collecting at Museum of Looted Antiquities is developing red flag tools. The parallel world of Nazi looted art, which has been studied for a lot longer than the illicit antiquities trade, there are a list of red flag dealers. And if you're looking at a provenance for a painting that changed hands in the 1930s or 40s, you are looking for a series of names associated with Nazi looting. We don't really have that yet for the illicit antiquities trade. We know some very familiar names. There are other less known names that are less known. And so as a due diligence tool, we need to develop these red flag names and give potential buyers and institutions interested in doing real due diligence the data they need to study this issue. So that's one thing that I think we're going to be able to do with the data we're collecting at AMOLA.
That's such a great idea. We've been doing something similar too at the Antiquities Coalition, where we've been, for lack of a better word, going through public records and pulling out the names to create a sort of rogues gallery of people who've been involved in the trade. And it's pretty interesting to see, in looking at different cases, some of the same names keep showing up. So how we can put that information out there, I think, is really important, so that it's an opportunity for people who are buying to check against those names. Jason, I think that's really a smart idea.
There's a new generation of curators and auction house employees, and even in the dealer community, who are aware of the risks of this issue and who want to do the right thing. It's not everybody, but we want to give people who want to do the right thing the tools they need to act accordingly. And I think that's kind of one of the responsibilities we do as we call out the bad actors, is also giving people who want to do the right thing the necessary tools to do that.
Well, through your writings and through the Museum of Looted Antiquities and other things, you've really helped raise awareness that this is not a victimless crime, that there are victims, that it is criminal activity, that it's supporting organized crime, and in some cases, even terrorists. So as you look ahead, what are some of the things that have inspired you to keep doing this work?
Yeah, my wife would tell you that this is an obsession of mine, and it doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface. I have a company that I run, and it keeps me quite busy. And I do this in my spare time, mostly on a volunteer basis and as a hobby. And the reason I do it is because this issue, it's a fascinating world. Understanding how this black market works is something that is interesting inherently, and it ties to the art market in ways that are novel and surprising every day. It's also been very inspirational to work with people around the world who have been sensitized to this issue, who have had the kind of aha moment where they realize that the objects on display at our local museums sometimes have nefarious backgrounds, and that is not a story everybody knows, and who are intent on keeping and protecting archaeological sites and monuments around the world. So some of my best experiences have been connecting with people, whether they be journalists or archaeologists or people in civil society who care about this issue in far-flung places that I've never visited, and building a collaborative relationship with those people to study this issue. This is a transnational crime, and so it requires a transnational response. And that means that both law enforcement and kind of members of civil society need to build bridges across long distances to work together to disrupt this illicit trade and to piece together the really complex puzzle to understand it. And so I have had the pleasure of working with people in India, in Nepal, in Cambodia, in the Middle East, in South America, forming relationships mostly online and digitally through the various platforms that we have to collaborate and work together to do this. Most of us are doing this as a hobby and as a passion, and there is not a lot of funding to support this work, but we're able to accomplish a lot because we're passionate about it and because we can work across borders.
Well said. And I certainly feel the same way. For me, it's a passion too. So thank you for all the good work that you're doing. And definitely thank you for joining us on Tholos Talks today. We were delighted to hear your insights and the amazing work that you continue to do, and what a difference you've really made. Your work has really shed light on the hidden costs of collecting and some of the moral choices that shape how we preserve or plunder our shared past. And we hope that this conversation inspires our listeners to view cultural heritage not only as an art, but also as identity, memory, legacy, and to consider the deeper question of who truly owns history. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilinna Institute, available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilinna website.